Les outils de l'homo faber, qui ont donné lieu à l'expérience la plus fondamentale de l'instrumentalité, déterminent toute œuvre, toute fabrication. C'est ici que la fin justifie les moyens. Mieux encore, elle les produit et les organise. La fin justifie la violence faite à la nature pour obtenir le matériau. Le bois justifie le massacre de l'arbre. La table justifie la destruction du bois.
They're not even needed for work. We need to house them, cage them, and find other ways of making money off of them. That's how the capitalist system operates. And so that's the social function of intellectuals, is to be part of the social triage that reproduces social hierarchy. So the idea that you would do intellectual work that would somehow be devoid of politics, or that you'd have to figure out what the link to politics would be, or what your political commitments might be, this is all an ideological myth. You don't have to figure this stuff out. It's already there. If you are trained as an intellectual in a particular set of institutions, you are always already an instrumentalized intellectual, because there's a system of material, social, and institutional constraints that have produced you as a subject and bequeathed to you a very specific social role.
Today, when the word controversial is easily thrown on everyone or everything, it will be offensive to call Agamben controversial. He is beyond ordinary idea of controversy, and it is trivial to call him a subversive thinker, but perhaps he is both. He dares to go where angels feel uncomfortable. His thought contains something profoundly disturbing and prophetic, intensive like a massive grinder and redemptive at the same time. There is something subtle, soothing, almost graceful in his, and in the same time something dangerous in his thought. Something like a pharmacon. Foucault will describe the problem of biopolitics as the art of governing through which desired form of citizenship is produced.
I read constantly and try to get as much out of every book as it deserves, frankly. And a good many of the books that are published today are articles expanded into books. There's just a lot of fill and a lot of space. That is not characteristic of your book, which is why I'm enjoying this conversation and why I greatly appreciated the book. I think with an accomplishment that is fairly rare these days, every one of your chapters actually does important work. And so I want to ask you if I could just follow through your chapters, because in a way that, frankly, doesn't fit most conversations, your chapters do establish the point. And I'm just going to mention
the notion of will
I ask you the first question,
is developed
you divide the book
from another concept to which it remains always strictly related. The verb to will is always
well, citizenship was
in some way grafted on the
people
verb
were not shy
can.
in ancient philosophical work, so Aristotle was positive about
So
Plato.
the problem of will is linked to the problem of
potentiality. Always
potentiality,
have greater means to
possibility.
change, warp, leverage government, and the poor will not be an independent voice because they will look to the state for sustenance. But the middle class, if they were property owning, I guess today that would be not a 10-acre farm, but a house or a 40-acre farm in our experience. And they were economically autonomous. They could voice their disagreement or their views to both the wealthy and the poor.
If we follow that path, we have a rendezvous with the former Yugoslavia, or Iraq, or Rwanda, and everybody will go tribal. Once one group goes tribal, then the other people, for their own survival, will go tribal.
We moved the clock forward the closest it has ever been to midnight.
Advertising agencies have always been mystified as to why is the storyboard more effective than the final product. And the answer to that is very important. It is that the incomplete form allows the audience more participation than the completed form.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
How many times do you suppose you've heard words to that effect, announcing a commercial? Often, probably, since they're sandwiched between the hours of TV viewing time. The quality and entertainment level of the commercial is getting very high. Fierce competition keeps the advertising agencies constantly reevaluating and recreating their images. To get and hold the viewer's attention, the advertisers reach for new ideas. More and more, because of repeated showings, the new approaches become familiar and accepted.
People have always been unaware of new environments because they're afraid of them. From the moment of birth, people sense that the environment, the new environment around them, is hostile. It's a real threat to their whole existence. And so every time an environment changes, we hasten to seek security and comfort in the old environment. I was delighted to come across a passage in Shakespeare a few days ago, a familiar passage, which suddenly revealed the same message. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin, that each, with one consent, pursues newborn gods, though they be made and molded of things past.
And then you immediately find that scholars, the first thing they will say, the concept of will is a modern one. Greek classical philosophy does not, ignores the concept of will. This is part true, and it's also true. And then what I found, trying to follow the birth of this notion, modern notion of the will, is that the notion of will is developed from another concept to which it remains always strictly related. The verb to will is always, in some way, grafted on the verb can.
This magnificent event illustrates anew what man can accomplish when purpose is firm and intent corporate.
While Greek philosophy focused on potentiality and possibility, Christian theology, and following it modern thought, focuses on the concept of will. The verb to will replaces the verb can. Man is no more a being of possibility, a being who can, it is a being who will. Now, can and will, also ought, are what in philosophy and grammar are called modal verbs. That is, as ancient grammarians used to say, verbs that are empty, in the sense that this verb, in order to acquire a meaning, need to be followed by another verb. So I can say, I walk, I write, I eat, they are not empty. But I can, I will, they need another verb to complete them. I can write, I will walk. And I'd like to draw your attention on the fact that philosophy is a strange discipline which works precisely with these empty words. Philosophy could be defined as an attempt to grasp the meaning of these empty verbs, to tie them to the other, to graft the one to the other, to split them, then to tie them again. And perhaps this knotting together of the empty modal verbs reached its extreme point in the drastic and almost insane formulation by which Kant expresses the core of his moral. Man muss wollen können. You must, can, will. It's really insane. It's insane. It means nothing. You must, can, will. So anyway, the absolute intersection of these empty modal verbs defines in some way modernity. And now to conclude, I've just chosen an example to show how the notion of will grounds on the notion of potentiality and possibility. And the strategy here is to check, to limit, to put a border to this notion of potentiality. To can is a dangerous thing, and will is employed just to check, to control what you can. So it's a very clear example, I think. You know that in Christian theology, God is omnipotent. The almightiness of God is a dogma. Credimus in unum Deum Patrem omnipotentem. So it's a dogma, no discussion. God is omnipotent. So the theologians had to admit this, but this fact had incredibly embarrassing and dangerous consequences. Because if God is omnipotent, if nothing is impossible for him, if he can anything, this means that he could, for instance, have decided not to incarnate in Christ, but in a woman, or in a war, or in a dog. I just choose the example theologians, I'm not inventing nothing. If God is omnipotent, he could have chosen to damn Peter and save Judas. He could have decided to destroy the creation. He could have decided to lie, to commit a crime. And that's it. It's very curious. A theologian, a really strange-minded person. An example of this problem of God's almightiness, on which we have thousands of pages, is that God, if he is omnipotent, he could give back virginity to a raped woman. So this seems really impossible. I don't know why this seems so impossible. Okay, from 11th till 14th century, this question, this scandalous question, this kind of dark, scandalous shadow of the potentiality was debated among theologians. And what I just wanted to present you is the solution, the remedy they found for this difficulty. The solution was this. According to what they call the potentia absoluta, absolute potentiality, God can do anything. But according to what they call potentia ordinata, ordered potentiality, God can only do what he willed to do, what he chose to do, what he decided to do. So, in abstract, according to potentiality as such, he could do anything, but in reality, he chose, he commanded, potentia ordinata means order, commanded potentiality. So he commanded to his potentiality, and from that moment, he can only do what he chose to do. and expressions of potential means literally commanded potentiality. I think that you can here really clearly see the function, the strategy in which will is employed. Will is that what limits, controls, commands potentiality. It is what contains within its bounds the scandalous chaos of potentiality. And then the same is true for man. Also, man could do anything, but he has to will. And once he decides, once he wills, he will do what he will. So you see that Nietzsche's hypothesis was correct. To will means just to command. And what it commands to is potentiality. And I would like now to give the last word of this brief archaeology of the will and commandment to one of my favorite Melville's characters, Bartleby the Squealer. Remember, to the man of law, he's working for a man of law, and the man of law tries to understand his strange behavior, reducing it to, wait, you mean that you will not? And he always answers, no, I just would prefer not to.
If you find yourself constantly saying this, oh my god, I used to love this great leftist, but then overnight he turned into a far-right fascist, maybe it's worth reflecting on whether or not you are stuck in an archaic left-right frameworks with no relevance to neoliberal global power. So, this is Todd McGowan, right? McGowan. He's really popular psychoanalyst, talking about Zizek and a bunch of things. If you don't know who he is, I don't know, he's really popular these days. I don't understand necessarily why. So what's happening is Todd and Benjamin Bratton here. Benjamin Bratton is actually a colleague of mine from my college. Attack actually one of my professors, same college, the European Graduate School, on this issue. Benjamin Bratton, or how, talking about what the fuck, or how philosophy failed the pandemic. Now, what's interesting here is that you can see what is a really genuine deep thinker, right? Agamben, who in 2020 came out with this really strong statement, denied by Benjamin Bratton in 2021, and just recently, as 3 or 4 months ago, by Todd McGowan, in October of 2020, he makes this argument against Agamben, and we're going to be going through it. But before we do go through it, I just want to say that you can really see here which perspective is the aged milk, right? Look at what, now what's happening is, if you haven't been following me, I've been on Twitter fighting fascists a very long time. For the last little while. That's why I haven't been making videos. Just because Musk opened up Twitter, so it became a very good place for debate. Now, what's really funny is that we can see that Agamben's view from 2020 has lasted, and the conspiracy theories about increasing politicization, about biopolitics, about the state of exception, all of those kinds of things are finding more and more truth. And Agamben was very keen, very astute to notice this right away, and to call it out right away, and to even write a whole book about it right away. I mean, to put your life on the line. I mean, a lot of us philosophers, Zizek, even a lot of people chose to withhold, having an opinion about the pandemic, right? But Agamben came in straight up and said this is biopolitics, biopolitical power. And guess what happened? At the time, even everybody, even I as a student of Agamben, we were all wondering, is Agamben stepping over his line? Then Benjamin Bratton brings up this essay. So the pre-reading for this is How Philosophy Failed the Pandemic by Benjamin Bratton. And now we're going to go through Todd McGowan's argument here. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and let's take a look at what's wrong, how this has become aged milk in this very short amount of time. And it's become aged milk because of this issue, okay? Because Russell Brand is now talking about how the Canadian government goes after people who are protesting against whatever by cutting off their digital bank accounts, right? That kind of thing. Who cares if they're right-wing or left-wing people? It doesn't matter. It's and Zizek had a very similar point, back in January 1st. Somewhere, I remember Zizek saying, wasn't it like a leftist nostalgia to like charge in the the parliament and being like, bringing in the communist revolution that way. I remember how Zizek stood up for the January 5th people in that sense. And now Agamben here is also labeled as, not only as, he's labeled as right-wing, right? And this is the insanity of continuing this left-right spectrum in a world where the right wing is more anti-capitalist than the left wing, right? It doesn't make any sense. So let's take a look at exactly, and if you don't understand why I think that the right wing is more anti-capitalist than the left wing, here we go. Quick recap. Whereas the left wing is consumed by capitalist realism, transforming all human social relationships into power relations, into cost-benefit analysis of human social interaction and emotional labor and privilege, bringing in the idea that the Holy Family was never really holy. This is what the debate is about and we're going to be talking about that more specifically, that the Holy Family was never really holy. You can look at Engels and Marx regarding that. The argument here from my other videos on Arendt and Strauss, we see that not only is the Holy Family, the question is not whether the family was ever holy or not. The question is actually one step before that, is whether we were ever actually secular, right? So the idea is that we weren't actually ever secular to think that the Holy Family was never actually holy, right? So the idea is that. So whereas the right wing is continually wondering about whether capitalism and Christianity can coexist, right? This old classic conservatism versus the Ayn Rand conservatism, where they also try to commodify everything. So we have four aspects here. We have the anti-capitalist left, the actual left, which is very, very tiny these days, because what, again, Gabriel Rockhill calls the left in academia is actually the policing of the left. So when you hear the left in academia, it's actually the policing of the left. It's what is allowed in the curriculum. And the reason is why it's allowed in the curriculum is because all these power play politics are actually a form of neoliberal leftist subjectivity. So, and we talked about the history, and you can watch my history of mental health regimes that create leftist subjectivity or neoliberal subjectivity video. So that was just a quick recap of the position that we take up on this channel, and let's take a look at why Todd McGowan is aged milk within 3 months, and aka he's not. See, what is the task of philosophy? The task of philosophy is always, what does Baidu say? Always to corrupt the youth. The task of philosophy is to corrupt the youth. That means that whatever our gods today, the task of philosophy is to corrupt the youth from the gods. But you see, this is not a philosopher. He is a political theorist. It's different. And from his political theory, is not he goes after Agamben. Now let's see what he's saying, okay?
So she shows him 3 pictures, and the first picture is a picture of a cow, and she's like, what do you see? And he goes, I see a couple having sex. And she's like, okay, notes that. Shows him a second picture of the Empire State Building, and she's like, what do you see? And he says, I see a couple having sex again. And then she shows him another picture of a cake. And she says, what do you see? He says, I see a couple having sex again. And she goes, it's true, you were right, you're obsessed with sex and it's problematic. And he says, what are you talking about? You're the one showing me all the smutty pictures. So I can't hear everyone laughing. I hope that everyone is laughing. So that's going to be sort of my take on the theory of biopower. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about Leibniz.
He's saying it's a projection. I mean, it's a very weak...
survival and the exigencies of the ruling socioeconomic system. The attempt to preserve life, which would seem to be the primary operation of contemporary power, actually interrupts and disrupts the functioning of capitalism. It's not just...
Here is where Todd McGowan doesn't understand. It doesn't matter if you're left or right when there's a pandemic. Kings, ancient kings, would have quarantined areas. 2,000 years ago, we would quarantine. So it's not a left, and quarantining is not a left or right perspective. Quarantining is just a normal political state of exception perspective. That's it. It's not a left or right thing. Okay.
Just an imposition of enforced survival on a reluctant but pliable populace. It's instead the expression of a politicized solidarity. And I think that's why it occasions so much political response on the other side. This is especially, I think, the case with the COVID-19 pandemic, although I think it's true in any natural disaster. And what's important, I think, is this pandemic affects disproportionately the elderly and those physically vulnerable, not the young and the healthy.
And you can see that regardless of your individual constitution, we are all treated as the same neoliberal subject. We all have to get this. I mean, you have to be watching Russell Brand videos to kind of understand that perhaps, the pharmaceutical companies weren't necessarily, doing the right thing in every aspect. I don't know why in some aspects we have systemic oppression for the left, but somehow the pharmaceutical industry is sometimes exempt, sometimes the academia is exempt, when academia is the locus of neoliberal colonialism. Why is academia exempt? People don't realize this.
Thus, the response requires a sacrifice on the part of those who are not endangered on behalf of those who are. And that's why I think a lot of people are reluctant to make that sacrifice.
So another mistake that he makes here is that the state, the biopolitical state that needs to keep subjects, and I say subjects, not citizens, subjects alive, is going against the capitalist system, but that's not actually true. Capitalism is also something that needs to keep people alive. Capitalism doesn't kill you. Why does he think that capitalism kills you? Capitalism doesn't kill. Capitalism keeps us all alive on a lifeline, on a biopolitical lifeline. That's exactly what we're talking about, right? And how does it do that? By there's so many ways that through the pandemic, look at what Justin Trudeau is doing. Look at what all of these little kinds of things that are happening within the World Economic Forum, normalizing a different world, normalizing digital passports. I mean, all these kinds of things that we were warning about before. Before, 100 years ago, when people did not have passports, right? People were freer. You could go to any country you want. You don't need a passport. See, the Westphalian state-style passport structure is being exported into the digital world, which is incredibly scary. And that is fully biopolitical. So that's all about the state of exception, right? Compare the state of exception of the Treaty of Westphalia. And if you don't know the Treaty of Westphalia, it's basically the border creation. Before, we had castle, and the power of the castle and the king emanated from the castle, and the power basically got less and less as the king as you get farther and farther away from the castle. You could just run away from the castle, and you could do any crimes that you wish as a anarchist or whatever, as a non-feudal person. But you needed also the protection of the castle and all that stuff as well. But today, the Westphalian state changed that order into the locus of power being on the border, in the state of exception, right? During the state of exception. And that's where the nomadic people are. So the state of exception is kind of a dual sword in a way, because it's also this realm of kind of freedom. So that's where the kind of fascism can come in, because here in the desert of nothingness, you have to decide between which side you're going to be on.
Instead of aiding in the process of capitalist accumulation, the measures designed to address the pandemic operate as a brake on the capitalist system.
See, the capitalist system, the pandemic is not something that's the capitalist system just can't handle. The capitalism does everything to handle whatever kinds of tragedies is thrown at it, right? People say that we went to war in Ukraine because of capitalism. Capitalism does not try to put the lives of people under threat for a nuclear war. That's just not a risk assessment viability in a capitalist thing. Capitalism profits from whatever the natural disaster might be. It's not that, look at the pharmaceutical companies that have expanded. Look at all of the corporations that have expanded their might, digital power, and digital passports, all of this kind of. Look at which sectors of the economy failed, and look at which sectors of the economy succeeded. All of those parts of the economy that were already part of the state, that were already subsidized, let's say, are doing well. Those are the state capitalist enterprises, right? That's what neoliberalism is all about. People don't understand. Neoliberalism is not laissez-faire. Neoliberalism is active government involvement to create neoliberal subjects, within the world that we create. That's active government involvement. Both Hayek at the end of his life realized this very point about monopolies, currency, and all this kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing that both right-wing libertarians don't understand, that neoliberalism is actually the expansion of the state. Look at the Reagan era, it's expansion of the state. And it's something that a lot of leftists just fail to understand as well, right? They don't understand that neoliberalism is not laissez-faire. Neoliberalism is the expansion of the state. Laissez-faire is classic conservatism. Classic conservatism means what? Means that Jesus kicks the money changers out of the marketplace. Classic conservatism, classic republicanism means that there are supposed to be the family, the republic, the democratic republic, the parliament, and the church and various other sites are supposed to be economically free. You're not supposed to bring economics into your politics, right? That's what classic conservatism was about. It got hijacked by the Ayn Rand movement. So those classic conservatism, what these people see as fascists, right? They see, and the funny thing is, a lot of people also confuse fascism and neoliberalism here, thinking it's the same thing, or fascism and capitalism here, thinking it's the same thing. Fascism, when push comes to shove, fascism goes against capitalism. When push comes to shove, fascism goes against capitalism. Why? And we know this because during World War II, when the Soviets and the Americans were coming in from both sides, it was the last stand of the German Nazi regime. What did they do? They put war effort, they removed resources from the war effort and into the killing camps instead. They increased the camp concentration of camp power, the state of exception that is used. Now, this is not a limitation of the biopolitics argument. This is a whole, look at which argument is going to be aged milk, Todd McGowan or Agamben, and Benjamin Bratton. Who's going to be aged milk in 5 years when we're all normalized, right? At first, we are outraged that Google and Facebook can track our mouse clicks on the screen. 2 years later, we all become normalized to it.
Even when they're
that's the
even in
exception.
the term when they're couched in terms of aiding capital, I think they're still in some way functioning as a kind of a break. So at the moment when it imposes restrictions,
see, he even realizes that. He even says right now, it even functionally is a kind of a break. It's not a break. It's just another risk assessment. Okay, capitalism is resilient.
On economy and on the project of accumulation, state power ceases to work hand in hand with the forces of capital, which it's often trying to do. So power exposes itself at these moments as fundamentally divided rather than singular, and testifies, I think, to the vitality of the field of political contestation. Thus, the pandemic and the response to it show that the theory of biopower actually marks a fundamental theoretical misstep, a misstep that's had, in my view, baleful political consequences because it distracts us from the primacy of capital within the social order and puts the focus onto power, which I think is...
That's not true. Look, the capital is always the decider. Okay, capital is always the decider, and Agamben is still focusing on capital. But what does Agamben mean by capital? And this is why we have to be a really deep Agamben scholar to understand. The thing is, I think I read this, Where Are We Now, when it first came out. The thing is, I don't even need to read it right now because I'm a deep Agamben scholar. I understand Agamben because you have to follow all of Agamben's work. This is just another addition to all of Agamben's work. And So, which work do we need to look at to see? We have the different parts of his omnibus Homo Sacer, and the one that we need to read here is The Kingdom and the Glory.
Divided rather than singular, and testifies, I think, to the vitality of the field of political content, or actually, in my view, within the amorphous measures that interrupt the flow of capital. So social distancing.
Did social distancing,
lockdowns,
lockdowns and mandates disrupt capital? Look at the stock markets of all of the online companies that have, it just moves capital around. It's not a disruption of capital completely. It's a disruption of capital for who? Disruption of capital for mostly small businesses.
Mask mandates. The leaders of capitalist states institute these measures in the name of allowing citizens to continue to live, but they recognize that such measures have a deleterious effect on the economy, which is why they occasion so much resistance.
That's not true. The leaders of the actual rationalization is longer than that, right? Okay.
Especially from right-wing proponents of unbridled liberal capitalism. These are not simply expressions of domination, I don't think, but moves that run afoul of the controlling socioeconomic.
Again, this is a problem with Todd McGowan seeing some people trying to focus on unbridled capitalism, but that's not, who cares about those people? Those are the villagers of America. No one cares about those people. What really matters is the people in New York, the neoliberals in New York. And what are the neoliberals in New York thinking?
Economic structure. So leaders employ them reluctantly because they have no interest in damaging the capitalist economy that runs their societies. But I think
actually they know how to. I mean, what did Musk do during the pandemic? He did some Bitcoin thing. He was, I mean, all of those capitalists, the real capitalists, the 1% capitalists, they knew how to move their money around way ahead of time. Capitalism is resilient. What Todd McGowan is going after here is a small business capitalist, the what's called the blunted proletariat.
I think the exigencies of people's survival and the solidarity that survival requires depend upon these state interventions. In this way, the conflict between the exercise of state power and the capitalist economy comes to a head in the response to COVID-19.
There's never a conflict, okay? The war in Ukraine, the pandemic, these are just problems where capitalism can prosper. When you're in a desert and someone when you're in the situation of the desert, or let's say there's no water, the capitalist will increase the price of the bottled water in the desert. That's what's happening. That's not killing anybody. That is basically siphoning more and more off of people. That's what's happening with inflation.
And the whole pandemic problem. In the midst of this response, it becomes clear, I think, that there's no pure exercise of biopower because there's no single site of authority.
That's a mistake. So the single site of authority comes from where? Comes from, again, what we're talking about is in the omnibus, in part 3, the kingdom and the glory. Not once does Todd McGowan talk about oikonomia, which is like the main problem here, is that the religion, the theological ordering of the economy, that's what we're talking about. There is a central site. There is a God. The God is what Foucault says. What is the God? The God is of supply and demand. The God of supply and demand is what even the scientific community is beholden to. So in the past, kings needed to bow down to the law of economics, and today, even science has to bow down to the laws of economics. So it's not that there's a conflict here. Okay, there is an overarching theological order, and that's what these people don't realize. These people think that they're atheists, right? They think that they are secular. This is the issue, right? Again, the reason why we have to talk about the secularity as the problem is because we have to go back to Kant. We have to go back to Kant. Ontotheology is the problem, right?
Divide between state and capital comes to a head when disaster strikes, which is what I think the theory of biopower fails to account for because it doesn't fully take the power of the capitalist economy into account. The natural disaster reveals that survival requires political solidarity and runs counter to capitalism's imperative to accumulate as an isolated monad.
I'm so sorry, but capitalism's imperative to accumulate needs survival. That's what the camp mentality is all about. Search camp mentality. What is the camp mentality? We're talking about the amygdala. The amygdala's inability to bring everything back into like a lizard mind frame, to the cost benefit of desire, right? This lizard perspective, right? That instead of the frontal cortex primal perspective. That's the camp mentality. It brings us back to our primal lizard perspective. And guess what? Capitalism is all about making sure that our lizard self is surviving, not dead.
Discrepancy between the state and capital, Giorgio Agamben proclaims that capital simply capitulates before the power of the biosecurity regime that now controls the state. So for Agamben, it's this regime, not capital, that actually holds the cards today.
It's a neoliberal theology. That's what holds the cards. It's not a materialist perspective. It's a theological perspective. Yes.
And in this little collection, it's a collection of articles that he wrote. He added a few things, but of articles that he wrote in response to the pandemic called Where Are We Now? He writes, capitalism, for its part, has only with a few exceptions accepted losses to productivity that it would never previously have considered, probably hoping that later on it can find an accord with the new religion of medicine.
Exactly.
I just found that a striking kind of claim.
Why is that so striking? It's already happening with pharmaceutical companies. Why is that so crazy?
That it's actually the religion of medicine that's dominant today, and capital's trying to turn.
Yeah, because he's talking about a survivalist mindset. What is the oikonomia that governs, right? What is the oikonomia? Capitalism is just the ritual that is added on to some sort of collective historical trauma. This like theological perspective that these materialist Marxists do not understand. Materialist Marxists saying that they're trying to be against the identity politics through material politics is not the way. We need to accept theology.
Trying to fit itself to that. I find that funny, I guess. So as Agamben frames it here, capitalism is not the strongest force in contemporary society. The pandemic
Neoliberalism is stronger than capitalism. What's the difference between commodification and the moralization of that commodification? The justification of that commodification. That's much more powerful than the actual commodification. Commodification is when you're talking about capitalism 50 years ago. We're talking about neoliberalism, baby.
Shows how it bows before the demands of what he calls the religion of freedom. But this position, I think, radically underestimates the dominance that capital typically has over the state. So I don't think it's a secondary force in our lives. Rather, it is the primary one.
Well, that's something we can agree on.
And the provenance of the resistance against the measures instituted to protect it.
But the thing is, McGowan doesn't understand that the whole theology, the whole argument is the whole omnibus. You have to read the whole omnibus from Homo Sacer to this camp mentality perspective. So it's all connected.
Against the pandemic, I think, indicates their political bearing. That these resistance movements are not emancipatory efforts struggling against the ruling order. They're not fights against an oppressive power structure. Instead, the resistance against measures used to fight the pandemic stem from those who champion the free flow of capital, from business owners and libertarians to Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro.
Okay, so just because those conservatives are not the ones in power, right? The real people in power are the neoliberal progressives. They're the ones who decide, not these reactionaries. These are all reactionaries. The fact that, and here it's interesting that now look at what he's saying now.
So confronted with being on the side of Trump and Bolsonaro, Agamben claims that we live in politically confused times where right and left, lose their straightforward significance. And this is again in this collection. He claims a truth remains such whether it is expressed by the left or enunciated by the right.
That's called neoliberal colonialism.
While this seems like just a neutral statement about the nature of truth, it's actually, I think, an indication of Agamben's radical turn to the right. So the leftist understanding of truth as...
So we got to go back to Emilio Gentile. Emilio Gentile. Now, Agamben comes out of a tradition of Italian communism. Now, Italian communism, if you study the work of Emilio Gentile, then you'll see that it's a lot more complicated than what is being expressed. It's a lot more complicated than fascism and capitalism are on the same side.
As I take it, necessarily includes the site of enunciation as integral to the truth being articulated. For instance, just to take a simple example, it's a far different matter when Donald Trump denounces the exploitative practices of Jeff Bezos and a union leader does so. Those are just two different things. Trump says this as to damage a competitor, even a political competitor, while the union leader says it as part of a collective struggle against the forces of big capital. So Trump uses the truth to lie because of the desire driving the statement, whereas this is obviously not the case with the union leader.
Perhaps.
The desire that informs...
Why is the union leader exempt? We don't understand. Our unions have been... Look at which union you talk about. Did you teachers union? Which union you talk about? Construction union?
The statement of truth, or why one is saying it, is always a part of what one says. And I think to take this into account, as Agamben doesn't do, is to play into the hands of the right, which must always ignore the logic of desire, I think. And the fact that Agamben finds himself on the same side as Trump and Bolsonaro in response to the pandemic, I think points to the
error of pointing out left and right, an archaic perspective of left and right over and over. The reason why we have the archaic perspective of left and right is because the modern idea of whatever is called the left, again, from Gabriel Rockhill, is actually the policing of the left. That's why.
The error of the theory of biopower's conception of politics. For these theorists, the struggle is always a struggle against power, which is typically manifested in the state. With the pandemic, however, a split opens up between the forces of the state and the forces of capital. And the site of power itself becomes...
Okay, what McGowan wants to talk about, rather, is not the divide between the capital and specific, this type of power, but rather two different types of power. The modern biopolitical power and the ancient kind of prison domination power that Foucault talks about. That's the real contradiction within the state. There is no contradiction with capitalism. There is no... This is an interesting statement to make. That's one of the, I guess, disagreements I have with Marxism, is that capitalism is shown to be incredibly resilient and able to take up whatever contradictions that it wants, just like Christianity, right? Christianity is something that doesn't look at contradiction as being a problem, but that's actually an opportunity, right? Same with capitalism. Regardless. And that's one of the things that I guess veer off from traditional Marxist determinists, or just Marxist. So the divide is not between capital and power, but actually the two different types of power that exist within the state order. The state order that seeks to discipline and punish. The discipline part is the biopolitics part, and the punish part is the ancient part, right? That's where it can't handle it. So when you are in prison or in the crazy ward of the prison, and there's a guy there's a guy in there who's smashing his head against the wall over and over and over again. Here is the state of exception. The state of exception where the police, the guard doesn't know, the psychologist can't do anything, the psychiatrist can't do anything, the police guard, the guard of the prison can't do anything because this guy is engaged in this contradiction, especially in Canada, of this biopolitical like liberal biopolitical real fix this person correctional facility thing, and this thing that needs to keep him alive, this capitalism, this neoliberal capitalism perspective with rights, okay, individual rights, versus the ancient kind of where all of this state repression first initially came from, which is the prison, right? The prison is where you send your political prisoners.
Radically and clearly divided. This is a divide that the theorists of biopower have difficulty reckoning with, which is why, aside from a brief comment about capitalism's capitulation to the forces of biosecurity, Agamben remains more or less silent about...
I don't think that McGowan is really framing Agamben's perspective in a correct way. Capitalism's capitulation? No. It's about this neoliberal theology, this oikonomia.
About capitalism during the pandemic. So the turn from economy to power leaves the theorists of biopower, I think, especially ill-equipped to analyze the structures of the capitalist social order. Capitalism doesn't rule through the deployment of power, but through inserting itself into subjects' desire, which is a term that...
Yeah. So inserting itself into the subject's desire.
Michel Foucault, for one, explicitly rejects. So by focusing on power, Foucault misses what drives subjects to commit themselves.
So wait. Doesn't rule the deployment of power, but through inserting itself into subject's desire, which is a term that Foucault, for one, explicitly rejects. So by focusing on power, Foucault misses what drives subjects to commit themselves to capitalist society. It's not that the power that capitalism has over them, but the way that it entices and structures their desire. So capitalism doesn't issue threats or commands, but rather entices with promises unlimited satisfaction, and the commodity will provide.
One invests oneself in capitalism for the promise of a future satisfaction that will never come, and the impossibility...
Well, actually it does come, right? That's the problem, right? The problem is that the god of capitalism is the most likely to have a return on your investment. Not like any other god. You pray to any other god, they're not going to listen to you. The god of capitalism will have much more of a chance for the god of capitalism to listen to you. This guy has a secular perspective of capitalism, which is a problem.
Of the future that capitalism holds out before us doesn't detract from its appeal, but actually augments it. We strive for what we cannot attain and never cease striving because we fail. Every time we fail, it fuels our desire even more. While the capitalist economy occasionally imposes its power on people, of course.
I mean, who says we fail? I mean, some of us fail, some of us succeed. The ones who succeed are the ones who are able to get rid of their morality regarding the exploitation of surplus capital and come up with a theology. They come up with a theology that management is not exploitation of surplus capital, but a addition to what you're doing. You're adding value. The manager doesn't extract, he adds value.
This is entirely a secondary operation. It rules through the logic of desire, not the discourse of power. And as long as Foucault and Agamben analyze the workings of power, I contend they will miss what keeps capitalism going, including the relationship that develops between capitalism and the state.
Is it because of Deleuze that he's focusing on desire?
What Foucault and his inheritors have in common with Marxism is the belief that the state is always an oppressive force. So Foucault and other biopower theorists don't often mention capitalism because they don't see it as fundamentally distinct from the power of the state.
Foucault doesn't often mention capitalism because they don't see it different from the... Yeah. Did you not read 1979 lectures on neoliberalism? It's like, what the hell?
In contrast to Marx, these figures don't see the state as simply the expression of capital's self-interest. Instead, both are expressions of power, and power is the problem. And the inability to theorize capital's dominance in an epoch when it manifests itself everywhere, I think, is a primary weakness of this theory. While Agamben worries a great deal about the expansion of state power, he's relatively silent about the role that the logic of capital plays in people's subjection. There's no sense that capitalism...
Are you kidding me? That's what all oikonomia is all about. It's all about this camp mentality.
Rather than state power, represents the fundamental threat confronting humanity today? I would argue that it does. There's no insistence that the project of emancipation must first and foremost take on the forces of capital in order to confront this threat. In fact, Agamben's interventions during the COVID-19 disaster bespeak his absolute resistance to any expression of state power, even if it might act as a brake on capitalist expansion. As he sees it, any exercise of power by the state in the name of preserving life has the effect of reducing persons to the status of bare life, of extending the regime of biosecurity through the announcement of a state of exception.
Yeah, check out China.
So authorities that take advantage of any occasion, something like a pandemic,
yes,
to increase the control over life, and this becomes the only real.
It's not the only real danger, but why does he say the only real danger? Why does he strawman like that?
Danger. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the distance between capital and the state, as I contend, blows wide open. In order to respond to the crisis, states around the world resort to measures that stop the flow of capital and restrict the functioning of capitalist society. The state's attempt to ensure the survival of its citizens takes on a kind of
Should we look at Amazon's stock price during the pandemic? So the pandemic started in the March of 2020, April. Okay, so the pandemic started around here. Let's say, whatever. Beginning of January 2020, we had a big plunge here, and then just rising stock prices for the S&P 500. What the fuck are you talking about? There was no disruption of capital. Look at this. Do you even look at the fucking stock market? Look at it. What are you talking about, stock disruption of capital? What are you talking about, McGowan? Look at, basic economics. These leftists don't know fucking supply and demand. Look at it. Where's the fucking, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? S&P 500 index. All the 500 plus companies have gained capital during the pandemic. Nobody's lost shit. What the fuck are you talking about, Agamben? It's fucking ridiculous.
Or it seems to me a clearly anti-capitalist hue. So states make emergency payments to all citizens, freeze evictions, expand free medical care.
Yeah, states will save their Evergrandes and their Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's and their, what's the Indian company that just recently got called out for massive financial play. The Indian government is going to protect that company no matter what, okay? That's what neoliberalism is, people.
Offer state-funded childcare and close businesses. These are not actions that are beneficial to capital. And if this is a state of exception, maybe we should try to make it.
What do you mean by capital? What capital are you talking about? Beneficial to capital. Look at this. We should say beneficial to the capitalists. And who are the capitalists? Let's look at the S&P 500. The top 500 capitalist companies how much have they made? Look at this. This is actually insane. They made more during the pandemic than they had ever time in their fucking history. The S&P 500 has made more during the pandemic than ever. What the fuck is Todd McGowan talking about? Fucking ridiculous.
Permanent. So
what the fuck are you talking about, McGowan? Agamben has fucking 500 books. What the fuck are you doing?
Of the state and the interests of capital come into opposition. The theorists of biopower have no way, I don't think, to account for this division, which is why...
What division, bro? What division? Look at this. What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
Agamben's
How are you a
response
professor?
to the pandemic has been so
if you don't even look at the fucking stock market.
Unable to recognize the potential radicality of the split between state power and the forces of capital, Agamben lumps both together under the rubric of biopower and launches a series of diatribes.
Diatribes? Who's doing the diatribes?
Against its expansion during the pandemic. When he does this...
Dude, you're taking a guy who's like Agamben, who's like deeply... I know the guy. He's my fucking professor. The guy is like drowning in books every day, okay? And you
When he
call
does
and you
discuss-
and you tell that diatribes? What? Todd McGowan, I've read parts of your work. There's nothing amazing there. Look at Agamben's ideas on omnibuses. Like, who are these people?
That's the difference. He laments capitalism's capitulation to the state and to the regime of biopower. And these diatribes, I think, show the failure of the theory of biopower to think through the politics of capitalist society in crisis. But more than this, I think Agamben's...
Isn't capitalist society always in crisis? Doesn't capitalist society make its own crisis? Isn't that what the shock doctrine is all about? See, we have a leftist shock doctrine here as well.
reactions to the pandemic highlight fundamental missteps that have always been present but never fully apparent. The pandemic reveals that the theory of biopower is not really a theory of emancipation after all, but a theory that ends up supporting the workings of capital. At various points, Agamben rails against social distancing, lockdowns, and even mask mandates. All of the means that the state has used to fight against the explosion of the pandemic receive his scorn, and none receive his
of course, this guy's a tanky.
endorsement. So if Agamben had his way, the vulnerable would be left to die, but at least they could die outside of the regime of biopower. As he sees...
Why are you strawmanning, Mr. Are you a philosopher? What kind of philosopher? Oh, I guess there's a bunch of them. There's Benjamin Bratton that does it too.
The responses represent the choice of preserving bare life over sustaining a form of life, which renders them complicit with the contemporary dominance of biopower. Opting for survival over a viable form of life leaves us with...
Well, the reason why there's no point in talking about what he says anymore is because he's just wrong. Okay, and we talked about it before. He doesn't understand what oikonomia is. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm going to see you in my soon videos on continuing with the work of Strauss on this very same subject. Thank you so much.
Opting for survival over a viable form of life leaves us with a world in which no one can live. This is how he would see it. So, as Agamben puts it in one of these letters, or one of these brief
Look at how he
essays, bare life and the danger of losing it is not something that unites people but blinds and separates them. Other human beings are now seen solely as possible spreaders of the plague, whom one must avoid at all costs, and from whom one needs to keep oneself at a distance of at least a meter. Agamben attacks the distancing used to stop the spread of the disease. As he sees it, social distancing is actually the worst type of oxymoron. So distance entails for Agamben the annihilation of sociality. So social and distance actually have nothing to do with each other. But I think this actually is right at the heart of the problem of Agamben's critique of the pandemic and the theory of biopower. So there's a kind of blindness, as I see it, within this theory to the role that mediation plays within social relations, a mediation that has to work through distance. So by keeping a distance from each other, we don't act antisocially.
Has this guy not read anything? Surveillance capitalism, taking care of the youth and the generations.
Instead, I think we uphold the social bond insofar as we utilize forms of mediation. Sociality occurs when I exchange letters, have a conversation, or engage in a discussion. All of these forms of sociality rely on the mediation of language, which connects us to each other by separating us.
So what Todd is talking about is for like healthy humans. Yeah, for healthy humans, there is a sense of, when you're passing someone in the beginning of the pandemic, when we were passing someone, people would avoid one another. As there was this double-edged sword, right? We avoid one another is a kind of can be seen as this amygdaloid camp mentality, avoiding one another, but it can also be seen as a fraternal siblinghood, I care about you, nod, avoiding one another. So there is a double-edged sword, and I think that both perspectives are viable.
The mediation of language provides the basis for the social bond, but it does so at the cost of actual proximity.
So the difference between Todd's perspective, Todd is talking about the optimist perspective of healthy humans in interaction with each other, but what Agamben is talking about is not those healthy humans. What Agamben is talking about is people on the top and the bottom of the ladder, which are seized by this neoliberal drive to turn everything into cost-benefit analysis, this amygdaloid perspective, right? So from that perspective, yeah, there's definitely a camp mentality that exists. How many people are completely overburdened by their cleaning schedules today?
So when I relate to the other through words, these words enact a barrier between us, but the barrier is actually an enabling one. And this mediation...
Does Todd not know anyone that's like overly worried about, getting the sickness? There's a lot of people that are extremely overly worried about it, right? There's the people who are underly worried about it. There's people that are way overly worried, and that's what Agamben's talking about.
Creates the bond
that
through
camp
distance,
mentality.
And this enables the bond to exist through the separation of subjects from each other. So social distance actually makes sociability possible, I want to contend, through the creation of an interstitial space that mediates between various subjects. Or I can interact with the other because the mediation of a public world gives me breathing space where the other is not overpresent.
There is no public.
In contrast to, say, familial relations that involve over proximity, the social bond holds us together through social distance. Far from being an oxymoron, then, social distance actually represents the only possible form of sociality. The move from proximity to distance is the
only possible form of sociality.
Move
Mr.
from
Universalist.
a closed connection of the family to the open bond.
Distance of the family to the open bond of society. Distance is the move from a closed connection of the family to the open bond of society. Again, we come back always to the family. We always come back to this. I mean, I don't understand why the left think that it can dismantle. It could dismantle kinship bonds and turn the left dismantles kinship bonds in hopes of bringing communist relationships with one another. But what does it do instead? It opens us up for capitalist exploitation. It opens the family and kinship bonds into capitalist exploitation. That's what's happening in third world countries. That's what's happening in the villages in the West where people are not happy.
Of society. But instead of recognizing that distance is the sine qua non of sociality, Agamben ties our social being to proximity, which is why he recoils so harshly from this term social distance. So I think...
Well, we do need to have sociability. We need to be there in person because there are... Now we're going to talk about the problem with the medium being the message and all this stuff about the digital world. We have to be there to smell each other's pheromones. Okay?
I think we need to have the courage to accept that disasters are simply disasters, that they don't hold a secret upside that renders their occurrence more palatable. But I also think we need the courage to recognize that survival isn't always ideological. And when the state has to resort to extraordinary interruptions of the capitalist economy to keep us alive, it's not necessarily...
Interruptions of the capitalist economy. Interruptions of the capitalist economy. Can you see what kind of interruption this is? It's the biggest interruption of the capitalist economy. In the history of capitalism. How is this a disruption, bro? It's just went up, it went down. It's higher than it's ever been for the S&P 500. What are you talking about?
Acting as the stooge of biopower. Instead, it's showing us the limit.
And then he calls Agamben the stooge of
to capital's dominance over our existence and exposing how our survival has to be a collective survival, not an individual one. The only real survival, I think, is survival through solidarity. And we can see in the disaster
we can see here how this is going to be aged milk in 5 years from now. Thank you so much.
Possibility of this conception of survival through solidarity.
From the moment of birth, people sense that the environment, the new environment around them is hostile. It's a real threat to their whole existence. And so every time an environment changes, we hasten to seek security and comfort in the old environment.
Techniques utilized in modern theatrical films.